My name is Howard Ernst. I'm a professor of political science at the United States Naval Academy. This is Channing Corbett. She's a research fellow at the Kohler Environmental Center. Today we're going to present our paper, The Power of Cyber Communication, the Influence of Virtual Social Networks on Environmental Behavior and Regulatory Tolerance. Channing's going to present the paper, and afterwards we'll be available for your questions.
So I would like to start out by addressing social capital, which refers to connections within and between social networks. Robert Putnam, the father of social capital, describes it as collective treatment that benefits individuals, communities, and nations by promoting interpersonal trust, improving information flow, and aiding problem solving. Putnam introduces social capital and in turn social networks. It has been found that social networks facilitate the diffusion of different types of knowledge and ideas, allocate resources and information, and promote commitment to a common set of rules by actors within the networks. So now we're going to look at exactly what a virtual social network is. We see it's a community of actors creating a social network while linked together virtually. There are likenesses between virtual social networks and person-to-person social networks, such as they both foster strong, intermediate, and weak ties between actors. Where we see virtual social networks surpass the capabilities of social networks grounded in the real world is that virtual networks can prompt greater levels of participation. By removing person-to-person interactions and focusing on text-based communication, as well as removing the emphasis from local networks and exposing actors to connectivity on a global scale, virtual social networks expose actors to a broad, diversified pool of information. The computer-mediated communication exchange within these global networks causes there to be a limited social presence. Information exchange in this setting leads to increased levels of participation from actors and also encourages actors to communicate more freely and creatively within their networks. Virtual social networks influence participation from actors, but now we're going to delve into what parts of a social network prompt this activism. One school of thought believes participation is dependent upon the structure of the network, because the structure of a social network dictates the direction of information flow between actors. It was found that most of the time, larger groups with greater group density tend to have higher collective activism. Yet, sometimes in larger groups, there's a decrease in the group's effectiveness. It was also found that networks with subgroups could detract or enhance joint action within a group. Sometimes they limit relational ties between subgroups, but other times they provide levels of high interaction between actors with similarities. Another network structure is called a core periphery structure, with individual that occupies a central position within the network. This allows for the ideas of the central individual to directly influence the other actors in a way of participation or non-participation. Another school of thought believes that the type of information exchanged within a social network is the main influence on actor participation. And this school of thought, it is believed that substance exchange dictates an individual's microenvironment. The presence of these microenvironments influences the overall environment of the network. By looking at the substance exchanged within a social network, we can see how differing environments bring different opinions and ideas to the table, creating a larger pool for actors to identify with and act upon. The last school of thought is a hybrid of the first two. It believes that participation is influenced by both network structure and substance exchanged within the network. These studies introduce the idea that an elite within the network, elite referring to an individual with greater access to information, this elite would be in a central position within the structure of the network and would also provide large amounts of information exchanged within the network. Network structures with bonding or bridging social capital are also main influences on participation from actors. Bonding social capital is best understood as lateral. It refers to localized ties between members of a community. Bridging social capital is best understood as vertical exchange. It refers to ties between actors that aren't connected by like groups. So now we move on to important network structures. So there's a lot of debate about which part of the network has the power to evoke the most participation or behavioral changes from a user. From the literature we read, 3 important structures stood out to control behavior the most. The first being bonding social capital, which, as I said before, is a structural communication pattern that consists of information exchange that can best be explained as lateral communication. This consists of talking to people that are accepted actors within your network. There's no branching out. It's staying completely within your unit. Bridging social capital can be seen as taking the next step. Bridging social capital is a structure that facilitates vertical communication. This would be communication with someone beyond your accepted friends or over a different type of social network. This brings us to the elite structure. An elite user is a user with greater access to information that can be exchanged. This creates a type of core periphery structure when one actor can greatly influence the information that is communicated. From the literature, we derived 3 key hypotheses. The first being virtual social capital matters. Virtual social capital variables build social capital and will be positively related to environmental behavior and regulatory tolerance. Our second hypothesis is that environmental identification matters. Self-identified environmentalists will have higher levels of participation and environmental behavior and greater tolerance for environmental regulation than those who do not self-identify as environmentalists. Our third hypothesis is that social capital and environmental identification interact. We believe that there will be a positive interaction between virtual social capital and self-identified environmentalism on the environmental behavior and regulatory tolerance variables. To test these hypotheses, we conducted a survey that recruited subjects through Amazon.com's Mechanical Turk. Mechanical Turk is a web-based tool that pays respondents to complete online tasks. The survey was posted for 2 weeks and was limited to United States residents with an acceptance rate of 75% and above. And we paid 50 cents per survey completed. There were 437 surveys completed overall. While it is not a true random sample, Ernst et al. In their 2011 study report that the demographics represented by Mechanical Turk users are more representative than those in accepted social science studies. The 2 key dependent variables in this study are environmental behavior and tolerance for environmental regulation. These 2 variables are scaled on a 1 to 5 scale, ranging from strongly disagree being a 1 to strongly agree being a 5. Bonding and bridging social capital are 2 main independent variables, and these are gauged on the same 1 to 5 scale, but 1 in this case is never and 5 is always. In order to test for the interaction variables, I took high-level environmentalists and high-level bonding and bridging and made the dummy variables. So in addition to the 2 bonding and bridging variables, we created dummy variables to test for the interaction effect. We did a bivariate analysis as well as multivariate regressions and a multivariate regression analysis with interaction dummies to control for the effects of third variables. In our bivariate analysis, we found that bonding and bridging were related to environmental behavior in a statistically significant manner. We also found a weak statistic significance for bonders and tolerance for environmental regulation. The other social network variables were found to be statistically insignificant. This provides some initial support for hypothesis 1, that at least some network structures relate to our two dependent variables. In order to control for the influence of third factors, we use a multivariate regression analysis. The dependent variable in all 6 of these models is environmental behavior. The first thing I would like to point out are the relatively high R-squared values that hover around 0.45, explaining about 45% of the fluctuation of the dependent variable. We see that across all 6 models, the environmentalist variable was the most powerful determinant in the models. In each model, the variable had significance on the 0.01 level, generally supporting hypothesis number 2. As we saw in Table 2, bonding and bridging remain statistically significant once the control variables are introduced. In Model 6, bridging remains statistically significant even after controlling for other social capital variables in addition to the control variables. Our dependent variable in these models has changed to environmental regulatory tolerance. Like the earlier models, we see relatively high R-squared values, though lower than the previous table. And we see environmentalist variable is related to the dependent variable in a robust manner yet again. This model differs from the earlier table in that none of the social capital variables seem to matter at all, but political ideology does. As you can see from the political ideology variable, liberals were seen to be more tolerant to environmental regulations than conservatives, though the findings in Table 3 do not suggest they engage any more in environmental behaviors. The main takeaway from this final table is that one of our 2 interaction variables is statistically significant. This suggests that at least for environmental behavior, there's an interaction between environmentalism and bonding, even after controlling for the individual effects of bonding and environmentalism. This provides limited support for hypothesis 3. In conclusion, in relation to virtual social capital matters, hypothesis 1, we found that 5 out of 8 of the social network variables were not related to any of our models throughout the study. And we also found that 2 variables were consistently related to one of our dependent variables, bonding and bridging related to environmental behavior. Overall, the support for this hypothesis is weak, but bonding and bridging variables stood out. We found that there is strong support for hypothesis 2, whether environmental identification matters. In all of our tests, it was consistently the strongest determinant of our dependent variables. Hypothesis 3, social capital and environmental identification interact. We found that the dummy variable we created for bonding and environmentalism was a statistically significant determinant of environmental behavior, providing limited support for hypothesis 3. In sum, it does appear that social capital influences participants in virtual social networks, though the relationship is complex and not always consistent across behavior types. Thank you, and we will take your questions.